A fireplace, a hidden passage, and marks carved into a stone wall deep underground, counting something or someone across 30 years of total silence. Nobody was supposed to find this, nobody was supposed to ask questions, and for decades nobody did. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to understand exactly what those marks were counting, and why the woman who made them chose to disappear from history completely. In the winter of 1887, a crew of workers hired to fix an old stone fireplace in a farmhouse on the edge of Harlan County, Kentucky, stopped dead in their tracks around mid-morning and refused to go back inside. The foreman, a man named Elias Prout, walked to the county clerk's office 3 days later and filed a written statement. Not a complaint, not a legal notice, just a record. He wanted something on paper before the rumors started spreading in the wrong direction. What his crew had found, hidden behind the back wall of that fireplace, was a passage, narrow enough that a grown man would have to turn sideways just to enter. It descended at a slight angle down into the earth beneath the house. Prout noted 2 things in his statement that made his men refuse to go any further. First, the passage had been sealed from the inside. Second, carved into the left wall at roughly chest height, someone had cut a series of marks into the stone. Not letters, not numbers, just marks repeating at regular intervals, like someone had been counting something for a very long time. County clerk stamped the document and filed it away. The folder went missing sometime in the following decade. The farmhouse changed hands 4 more times before anyone thought to ask why that single section of the back wall had been rebuilt so poorly, and why the mortar used on that particular section was 20 years newer than everything surrounding it. Welcome to the Fear Sermon, where we go looking in the darkest and most unsettling corners of American history for the stories that were never supposed to be found. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from tonight. The truth about what lay beneath that farmhouse did not come out all at once. It came in pieces, the way most ugly things do. A document here, a name there, a detail that only made sense when you set it beside 3 other details that no one had thought to connect before. What follows is the story of a house, a hidden passage, and the human decisions that made both of them necessary. Decisions that an entire family carried for decades in total silence, for reasons that, once you understand them, reveal something deeply uncomfortable about a particular chapter of American history. Harlan County sits pressed into the southeastern corner of Kentucky, right up against the Virginia state line, surrounded by a ridge of mountains that made it one of the most isolated places in entire Appalachian interior throughout most of the 1800s. The Cumberland Mountains did not simply surround the county. They defined it. They determined who could come in and who could leave, how fast news traveled, and how long a secret could stay buried before the ground eventually gave it up. To understand the farmhouse on Poor Fork, you first need to understand what Kentucky meant in the decades before the Civil War, and in the years that followed it. The state occupied a strange geographic position before it was ever a political one, a border state. Slaveholding but not seceded, southern in its economy and its social arrangements, but pressed directly against Ohio and Indiana to the north, where the law worked very differently. The Ohio River, which formed Kentucky's entire northern boundary, was more than just a line on a map. For tens of thousands of people, it was the most important line that existed anywhere. Crossing it meant one thing. Failing to cross it meant something else entirely. But eastern Kentucky, tucked deep inside its mountains, was not the Ohio River. It was not a quick dash across open water to the opposite bank. It was 100 miles of ridge lines and creek valleys, of settlements that were days apart on horseback in good weather and completely impassable in bad. Moving through that landscape required help. It required people who knew which routes were being watched and which were not. Which families could be trusted and which absolutely could not. which farms had root cellars deep enough to shelter someone through the night, and which had neighbors too close to risk it. In the decades before the Civil War, one of those farms was the Cornett place on Poor Fork. The farmhouse was a log and stone construction of the kind common across the region. 2 main rooms on the ground floor, a sleeping loft above, a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the kitchen, and a large central fireplace built from fieldstone that served as the house's primary heat source through the brutal Appalachian winters. The winters in Harlan County in the mid-1800s were not the kind of cold that inconveniences. They were the kind that kills livestock, splits wood left on the porch overnight, and drives the temperature inside an unheated room below freezing by midnight. The fireplace was not a decorative element. It was the literal heart of that house, and everything inside that building was arranged in relation to it. The farm had been established sometime in the early 1840s by a man named Harlan County, who had come down from Letcher County with his wife Margaret and 2 younger brothers. The brothers vanished from the county's official record within 5 years of the property being established. No explanation was ever committed to paper. Harlan County was not, by any surviving account, a remarkable man. He paid his taxes. He attended the Baptist congregation at Clover Fork with enough regularity to be considered a member in good standing. His neighbors described him as a careful farmer and a fair trader. His word, people said, was the kind that stuck. His wife Margaret was a different kind of person entirely. A neighboring woman named Celia Fugate wrote in a letter to her sister that Margaret was a woman who does not speak unless she has something worth saying, which makes her words count double. A circuit-riding preacher who visited the county in the 1850s described her as a woman of evident intelligence who conducts herself with a reserve that might be mistaken for coldness by those who do not look carefully enough. She was not cold. The subsequent history of the Cornett farm makes that abundantly clear. She was careful, and there is a significant difference between those 2 things. It matters enormously to everything that follows. The first documented sign that something unusual was happening at the Cornett farmhouse appears in a letter written in October of 1863 by a Home Guard lieutenant named Josiah Hensley, who was responsible for monitoring movement along the Poor Fork corridor during a period of intense guerrilla activity. The letter was a routine patrol report. Dry, descriptive, clipped. But buried in the middle of the 3rd paragraph is an observation that does not fit the routine character of everything around it. The patrol had passed within a quarter-mile of the Cornett property on a cold, overcast morning and had observed smoke rising from the chimney at a time when no household should have been awake. Not the tentative gray of earliest morning. The letter specified full dark, 2 or 3 in the morning. And the smoke was rising with the settled density of a fire that had been burning for hours, not one that had just been lit. 2 of Hensley's men, who paused at the tree line to observe the property, also reported hearing sounds from inside the house. Muffled, they said, as though someone were moving heavy objects across a stone floor. The sounds lasted roughly 20 minutes and then stopped with a completeness that one of the soldiers apparently found more unsettling than the sounds themselves. Like the way a forest goes quiet when something is moving through it, and the quiet itself starts to feel like information. When the household stirred at a normal hour just after dawn, nothing appeared out of order. Harlan came out to see to his livestock at the usual time. Hiram split wood near the barn with the easy regularity of a man who has done it since childhood. There was nothing in the household's daytime behavior to suggest that anything had happened in the night. What Hensley did not know, and what would not become clear until decades later, was that this same observation, smoke before dawn, sounds of movement in the night, and a household resuming its ordinary routine, as though nothing had interrupted it, was made on at least 6 separate occasions by at least 4 different people across the war years and the years that immediately followed. The pattern was there, documented in letters and diaries and account books spread across the county's paper record, waiting for someone to read all of them at once and recognize what they were actually describing. A woman named Dovie Napier, who lived half a mile downstream, mentioned in a letter to her daughter that she had twice arrived at the Cornett farm in the very early morning and found signs that fire had been burning through the night, a quantity of ash that did not match a fire lit at dawn, a hearthstone still warm in a way that spoke of hours of sustained heat, a layer of wood smoke clinging to the curtains and the furniture with a persistence that meant hours of burning, not minutes. She had not asked Margaret about any of it. I did not think it was my place to ask. She wrote to her daughter, and Margaret did not offer, and we went on talking about the garden and about Ruth's cough, which had been worrying her all month. A traveling Methodist preacher named Orville Tate recorded in his circuit diary under an entry from March of 1865 that he had spent a night at the Cornett farmhouse and had been disturbed from his sleep by sounds he could not identify, not the ordinary settling of a log house in cold air, not animals in the barn. Something he described with apparent discomfort as a kind of rhythmic dragging, persistent below the level of the floor. It lasted the better part of an hour, and then stopped as abruptly as it had begun, replaced by a silence that somehow felt different from the silence before it. Denser, more deliberate. He had written it down because he was a man who wrote things down, and the writing down meant it survived. The last documented wartime observation came from an unlikely source. A Confederate irregular named Wade Sizemore, captured near Clover Fork in the summer of 1864, who during his interrogation made a passing reference to the Cornett farm. He had been moving through the county collecting intelligence and had developed a conviction that the farm on Poor Fork was being used for something beyond ordinary farming. He had observed lights moving at odd hours. He had on one occasion heard voices, low and quickly hushed, from inside the farmhouse at a time when he had counted the visible household members and found the number too low to account for everyone who had to be inside. But he had no evidence of a specific offense, and the interrogating officers were more interested in his military activities than in his suspicions about a farm in a hollow. The reference was noted and the conversation moved on. The war ended, but the silence that follows large-scale violence is never as quiet as it sounds from a distance. In Harlan County, the years after Appomattox were marked by the continuation of wartime grievances by other means. Old scores were settled, old alliances collapsed, men who had fought on different sides found themselves neighbors again, and the adjustment was not always peaceful. It was in this atmosphere that a man named Clarence Duff entered the story. Duff was not from Harlan County. He had come down from Pike County sometime in the early 1870s, a wiry, watchful man with calloused hands and eyes that people described as the kind that measured things. He was a stonemason and a competent carpenter, which made him immediately useful in a county working through a backlog of war-era repairs. His manner was not unfriendly. People who dealt with him on work matters found him capable and honest. But there was something about him that prevented easy intimacy. A held backness that some found merely reserved and others found evasive, depending on their particular antenna for the distance some men carry. His connection to the Cornett farm began in the spring of 1873, when Absalom Cornett, by then slowing down noticeably, contracted with Duff to repair the farmhouse's stone foundation on the eastern wall. The work was expected to take 2 weeks. It took 6. Duff's extended presence was explained at the time by the extent of the damage and by several days of rain that made certain tasks impossible. Neither explanation was false, but neither was complete. What was not explained was why Absalom Cornett paid Clarence Duff not purely in cash, as was the usual arrangement, but in a combination of currency and something that appeared in no invoice and left no clear paper trail. Duff's own account ledger, recovered much later from his personal effects after his death, contains an entry for the Cornett job that includes a notation added in different ink and a slightly different hand, as though it had been written after the original bookkeeping was finished. The notation reads, "Consideration received," followed by an amount and the abbreviation AGR, which may have stood for agreement, or may have referred to something far more specific that the abbreviation was designed to obscure. Between 1873 and 1879, Clarence Duff made at least 11 documented return visits to the Cornett farmhouse. Documented because people saw him on the road and remembered it, because the road along Poor Fork carried light enough traffic that a man on horseback was an event worth noticing. 11 visits over 6 years, each one unexplained, each one followed by Duff's quiet return to his ordinary life in Clover Fork, as though nothing had interrupted it. When a neighbor named Albert Souder asked Absalom Cornett directly about Duff's repeated appearances, Cornett said only that there were ongoing repairs to attend to. The farm always had something that needed fixing, and Duff was a reliable man with a good hand for stonework. The explanation was plausible, the kind of answer a man gives when he has both the right answer and a true answer, and he chooses the true one because it will serve the same purpose. Souder accepted it at the time, but later, giving an account of his conversations with Cornett to a county official during a legal proceeding, he recalled that when he asked Cornett directly what Duff was helping him with, there was something in the man's face that he had not seen there before, not fear exactly. More like the look a man gets when he is carrying something heavier than he wants anyone to know, and someone has just asked a question that comes too close to the weight of it. Absalom Cornett died in February of 1879 during a winter that killed livestock across the county. His death was attributed to pneumonia and was not considered suspicious at the time. Margaret outlived him by 7 years, remaining at the farm with their son Hiram, managing the household and the invisible infrastructure of trust and obligation that held the family's position in the community together. When Margaret died in 1886, the farm passed to Hiram, a taciturn man in his early 40s who had spent most of his adult life working the same land his father had cleared. Those who knew him said he received the inheritance with something more complicated than simple grief. Something that looked like the expression of a man who has accepted a burden he did not fully choose and is not yet sure whether he is strong enough to carry it the way it needs to be carried. It was Hiram Cornett who hired Elias Pruitt and his crew in the winter of 1887 to repair the fireplace's cracked mortar, and it was Hiram Cornett who gave Pruitt what appeared to be a completely straightforward assignment and then left the property entirely for 3 days without leaving a forwarding address. His neighbors noticed his absence. They assumed it was a family matter and did not press. When Pruitt's crew began removing the damaged stones from the back wall, they expected to find rubble and clay beneath. Standard construction, completely unremarkable. What they found instead, behind a section of wall that was demonstrably newer than the surrounding stonework, was the entrance to a passage. The passage, as Pruitt described it in his statement, was approximately 30 inches wide and roughly 5 feet tall at its entrance. Generous enough for a grown person to enter while crouching and moving sideways, but not built for comfort. The stones lining its walls were fitted without mortar, dry, stacked with a precision that suggested they had been placed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The floor was compacted earth, tamped flat and smooth in a way that required effort, the kind of effort you invest in a floor you expect to be used repeatedly. The ceiling was not stone but timber, heavy beams set close together and then packed above with a mixture of clay and small stones, engineered to support the weight of the floor above without creating the hollow sound that might give away the passage's existence to anyone walking through the room overhead. Someone had thought carefully about every single aspect of this construction. Nothing had been left to chance. The passage descended at an angle, Pruitt noted, as though it had been deliberately designed to pass beneath the frost line. Below the level where winter temperatures cause the ground to shift and heave, and a poorly built underground space eventually cracks and collapses. He estimated the angle at roughly 15 degrees from horizontal. The passage continued into the darkness beyond the reach of the lantern they had brought, swallowing the light at a distance of perhaps 30 feet and offering nothing back but a faint current of Cool air that one of his men described as the same air you get when you open a cellar that has been shut up for a very long time. Close and cold and carrying the smell of earth and stone. It was at roughly 10 feet in that they found the marks on the left wall, carved into the stone face with a tool, not scratched hastily with a nail or a blade, but cut with deliberate pressure, the marks of someone who intended them to be permanent. They were grouped in sets of 5 in the traditional tally fashion, 4 vertical lines and a diagonal cross stroke to make the 5th. The same system used by anyone keeping an account over time, repeated at intervals of roughly 18 inches along the wall. Prout counted from his position near the entrance, lantern held forward, at least 7 complete sets before the darkness made further counting impossible. 35 marks minimum, possibly more, probably more, given the depth of the passage and the deliberateness with which everything else had been constructed. Prout and his men stood at the entrance and looked at it, and said nothing for a while. Later he would describe this moment to several people as the point where his body arrived at its conclusion, before his mind caught up. His men were not going further into the passage. He was not going further into the passage. Whatever was down there was not something he and his crew were equipped to understand. And the specific quality of their not understanding it made it important that someone who might understand it be told. Which is why he filed the statement. Harlan County returned to the farm on the 3rd day after the discovery. He arrived in the late morning alone on horseback. He spoke with Prout in the farmyard with a quietness and a steadiness that Prout later said was the quality he remembered most clearly about the entire episode. Not anger, not distress, not the flustered embarrassment of a man caught in something, just a settled acknowledgement. As though Hiram had spent the 3 days of his absence reaching an agreement with himself about what was going to happen next, and had arrived back at the farm already at peace with it. He thanked Prout for stopping work. This detail struck the foreman as strange, the thanking, as though stopping had been a courtesy offered rather than a refusal forced. He paid the crew generously for the days they had worked and dismissed them without further conversation. He asked Prout before he left whether he had filed any documentation with the county. Prout said that he had. Hiram nodded slowly at this, as though the answer confirmed something he had already expected. Then he sealed the passage entrance himself using new mortar and stones, sourced from a weathered rubble pile behind the barn. Material that had been sitting there long enough that it would not look conspicuously new unless you were specifically looking for it. The work took him most of an afternoon. A neighboring boy named Monroe Begley stood at the yard fence for the better part of an hour and watched him do it with the frank curiosity of an 11-year-old who does not yet understand that he is witnessing something that will not become fully comprehensible for 60 years. Begley would work the coal mines when they came to the county. He would carry the image of Harlan County, sealing that fireplace wall through all of it. And when he finally gave an account of what he had seen to a local historian named Horace Cavender in the late 1930s, he described Hiram's manner with a precision that suggested the image had never once faded. He worked the way a man works when he is not thinking about the work. The hands know what to do and the mind is somewhere else. He mixed the mortar and he laid the stones and he pressed them into place, and he never once stepped back to look at what he was doing the way a craftsman would. He already knew what it looked like. He was finishing something, and then Begley said the thing that would stay with Cavender for years. The question I always wondered about but never asked, because there was no one left to ask, was whether he sealed it because he wanted to forget, or because he already knew there was nothing left inside that needed tending. Nothing left inside that needed tending. Because to say that nothing needed tending was to imply that something had needed tending before, that the passage had not simply been a construction, an artifact, a piece of hidden architecture, that it had been an active thing, a living thing in a sense, something that required maintenance and attention and care over time, something that people had used and returned to and used again. What had been done in that passage, what had been counted on that wall, The answers were not going to come easily. They were going to have to come from paper, from memory, from the willingness to sit with partial information long enough for the pieces to arrange themselves into something coherent. A physician named Dr. Samuel Reardon arrived in Harlan County in 1891, 4 years after Prout's discovery, hired by a mining company to conduct a survey of general health conditions across several communities. In the course of his survey, he interviewed an elderly woman named Priscilla Ballin. She was in her late 60s, born in the county, lived her entire life within 5 miles of the Poor Fork, and had known every family along that creek bottom for 60 years. When she decided to tell Dr. Reardon what she knew, she did not approach it indirectly or frame it as rumor. She said she had something to say that she had not said in many years, and then she said it. During the war period and in the years before it, she told him, the Cornett farm had been known among a certain group of people. She used the phrase people who had reason to move carefully, with a deliberateness that Reardon noted in his transcription. She said she had known of at least 3 individuals who had come to the Cornett farm under specific circumstances and had not been seen again in the county afterward. In some cases, she said, this was the intended outcome, and the families of those individuals understood it and were grateful. In other cases, she was less certain of the outcome, and that uncertainty had stayed with her across the decades since. When Reardon asked her directly what kind of assistance the Cornett farm had provided, she was quiet for a moment. Then she told him that during the 1850s and into the war years, a person could sometimes need to move through the Kentucky mountains in ways that the law would not permit, and that the wrong neighbors would not tolerate. That the Cornett farm was a place where such movement was made possible for years, by people who had decided that certain things mattered more than the legal arrangements of the time. The second major piece of the story came from Clarence Duff himself, or rather from what remained of his papers when he died in 1894. Alone in a boarding house in Pineville. He died without family, without close friends, without anyone to sort through his belongings. His papers, an account ledger, a bundle of letters, and a personal notebook were claimed by no one and eventually passed into the possession of Horace Cavender, the schoolteacher who had been friendly with Duff in the last years of his life, in the way that a careful, curious man sometimes befriends an aging solitary, drawn by the sense that there is something worth knowing beneath surface that will never be offered voluntarily. Cavender had recognized, even before Duff's death, that the older man was carrying something. When the papers came to him, he began to find out what it was. What he eventually found was not in the individual entries of the ledger, but in the pattern of them and the spaces between them. The pattern of Clarence Duff's entire working life, reconstructed from the ledger, showed a man who took on jobs, completed them, and moved on. Except for a 6-year period from 1873 to 1879, during which a single client appeared in the record repeatedly, 11 times, for services that the ledger described in terms vague enough to be completely meaningless. 11 return visits to a single client over 6 years for work that Duff apparently could not or would not specify, even in his own private account book. The notebook was harder to read. Duff's handwriting deteriorated significantly in the later years of his life, and entire pages were nearly illegible. But Cavender had patience. Across months of careful reading, he found a series of dated entries corresponding almost exactly to the 11 return visits in the ledger. Brief, compressed, written in a notation that seemed designed for Duff's own use, rather than for any reader who might come after him. They contained geographic directions specific to local landmarks, time estimates, and what appeared to be the number of stops on a route. And in several entries, at the very end, a notation that appeared to be a count. Numbers written in different ink, sometimes with a plus sign followed by a smaller number, as though someone was adding to a running total across visits. Cavender reconstructed that total as best he could from the entries where the numbers were still legible. The total at the end of the last datable entry was somewhere in the high 80s or low 90s. The handwriting was too faded to be certain. But the implication of a running total, a number being carefully maintained and added to over time, tracking something that accumulated across years, was clear enough. And then there was the notation in the last legible entry from sometime in 1008, 178 or possibly early 1008, 179, written not in Duff's usual cramped hand, but in a version of it that was somehow both smaller and more deliberate, as though the writer had taken unusual care with what he was recording. The notation read only, "The end wall. MC, her mark, let it stand. MC Margaret Cornett, her mark, let it stand." Cavender sat with this for a long time before he began to understand what it meant. And just when he thought he had assembled a reasonably complete picture from the ledger, the notebook, Dr. Reardon's survey notes, and Priscilla Bolland's account, he found a document that forced him to revise almost everything he had concluded. A letter misfiled among county tax records from the late 1008, 170s, written in the careful, precise cursive of a woman who had learned to write in an era when female literacy was not universal, and was therefore something she had actively worked for. Written in October of 1008, 177, addressed to a person identified only by initials. Postmarked from a town in Ohio sitting directly on the northern bank of the Ohio River, across from the Kentucky shore. The letter made clear something that completely overturned Cavender's chronology. The passage had not been built in 1873, as Duff's notebook implied. Duff had extended something that already existed. The original construction was older, significantly older. And the marks on the wall had not begun during Reconstruction. They had begun during the war itself. No, earlier than that. The count that we began in the old cellar, Margaret Cornett wrote, was moved to the lower passage when the lower passage was made and continues there now, kept in the same fashion by the same hand as it was from the beginning. There are those who would call such keeping a vanity. I call it what it is. The only monument that was possible, and the only one that was wanted, the woman who could explain this was named Hattie Farler. She was in her late 80s when Cavender found her, or rather when she found him, having heard through the communication network of an isolated mountain community that someone was asking questions about the Cornett place, about the passage and the marks and Clarence Duff's repeated return visits. She sent word through an intermediary that she would speak with him. He rode 12 miles through a December cold that turned his breath to vapor in front of his face and made the road slick in the shaded sections where the sun had not reached since autumn. She lived at the head of a creek called Martin's Fork in a small house that had the settled, organic quality of a building that has never been fully separated from the person who occupies it. She was seated close to the fire when he arrived, wrapped in a quilt, with the stillness of a very old person who has learned to conserve energy the way a low fire conserves itself. Contained, steady, nothing wasted. She did not ask him what he knew. She asked him what he thought he knew. Then she listened to his account with an expression that shifted once, slightly, when he mentioned the count in Duff's notebook, and then settled back into a composure that he read as the expression of a woman who had been deciding for many years whether to have this conversation and had finally made up her mind. "You have most of it," she said, "not all of it. The part you are missing is the beginning. The beginning was not Clarence Duff, and it was not 1873, and it was not even the Civil War. The beginning was Margaret Cornett, and it was the late 1840s, and it was a decision that Margaret had made before the farmhouse on Poor Fork was more than a few years old. Margaret Bray had grown up in Letcher County in a family that straddled the particular moral geography of eastern Kentucky in the antebellum period. Not slaveholders themselves, but connected by geography and trade to both the institution and to the complex network of people who actively opposed it. When she married Absalom Cornett and moved to the Poor Fork farm in the early 1840s, she arrived already understanding what the farm's location made possible and with a very clear intention about what she was going to do with that possibility. Absalom was not unwilling, Hattie told Cavender, but he was not the originator. The operation, and it is entirely appropriate to use that word, because it had the organization and the sustained deliberateness of an operation rather than an impulse, was Margaret's conception, Margaret's planning, and Margaret's maintenance across all the years that followed. The root cellar behind the kitchen had been the first hiding place. It was already there when they arrived, standard construction, completely unremarkable. Margaret had assessed it within the first season on the farm, and had seen in it what a person with her particular state of mind sees in such spaces. Not storage possibility, not a cellar. A room with a door that locked from the outside and a depth that held steady at 52 degrees year, and a location at the back of the hill that was completely invisible from the road. The first person had come through in the summer of 1849. The network that made it possible stretched north toward Ohio and south toward Tennessee and operated the way such networks must operate, on absolute trust in the people it used and absolute silence. Toward the people it did not. The person had passed through and continued north, and when they were gone, Margaret had taken a nail and made a mark in the cellar wall. Not from any dramatic impulse, not from sentimentality, from the same practical cast of mind that made her note everything that mattered and record it in whatever way was available to her. The mark was a record. The person had been here. The person had passed through. Over the next decade and a half, the marks accumulated. Not rapidly. This was not an operation that moved hundreds of people in a season. It was careful and irregular, organized around the specific circumstances of the individuals involved and the current danger level on the various routes. Some years there were many marks, some years there were none. The count that accumulated was, in Margaret's own words, a monument. The only kind available to a woman operating in total secrecy, acknowledging the passage of people whose names could not be written, whose movement could not be documented, whose survival depended on the complete absence of any record connecting them to this particular hollow in Harlan County, Kentucky. When Clarence Duff came to the farm in 1873, he came for a specific purpose, to build the passage. The root cellar had become insufficient. The war had changed the county in ways that made the old arrangements precarious, and Reconstruction had not ended the danger. In some ways, it had intensified it, because the legal status of people who had been enslaved was now being contested through new legal mechanisms by people with resources and institutional support. The network had continued operating after the war because the need had continued after the war. Duff had been recruited through the same network. He built the passage and he built it well, and he returned 11 times across 6 years to maintain it, and when needed, to serve as a guide along the routes the passage connected to. The last time anyone used the passage, Hattie said, was in the early 1880s. Margaret was still alive. She counted them in herself. She said afterward that she counted because she wanted the number to be exact. She did not want to approximate what had been done. She wanted the record to be accurate. Cavender asked the question he had been building toward for years. How many marks are there, at the end of the passage, in the section that Pruett's lantern never reached? Hattie Farler was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted, settling lower, and the shadows in the room rearranged themselves around the new shape of the light. I was inside it once, she said. Margaret took me in the late 1870s. She wanted someone else to have seen it. She wanted a witness. I counted 112 complete tally marks, 22 complete groups of 5 and 2 additional marks that had not yet reached the 5th. The count, in other words, was still open when the passage was sealed, still waiting for a cross-stroke that would never come because the passage was closed before it arrived. Cavender sat very still. 112 people who had moved through the root cellar and then through the passage of the Cornett farmhouse on Poor Fork between the late 1840s and the early 1880s, in circumstances that required absolute concealment, 112 marks on a wall that no longer exists. Why did they seal it? Cavender asked. Why did Margaret finally seal it? She didn't, Hattie said. That was Hiram. After she died, he decided the risk had passed. Or maybe he decided he simply could not carry it the way she had. Maybe both. He sealed it, and then he hired the mason. And then he left for 3 days because he could not watch someone break open what his mother had built. Even if the breaking open was not really that. And the name, Cavender said. Duff's notebook had mentioned a name carved at the end of the passage, a mark different from all the others. Hattie looked at him for a long moment, then she described it. A woman's name, first name only, cut in careful letters 1/2 inch tall at the very end of the passage wall, where the corridor terminated at a stone face. A name that Cavender recognized when he heard it as belonging to no one he had ever found in any county record connected to the Cornett family. The name stood at the end of the count, not as a number, but as a person. The person for whom the count had been kept. The person who had been the reason for the first mark on the root cellar wall in the summer of 1849. The first one through. The one who had convinced Margaret Cornett that what she was doing was worth doing. That the risk and the silence and the weight of the secret were worth what they produced at the other end of that cold, narrow underground corridor. Cavender did not ask Hattie to repeat the name. He had heard it clearly the first time. And as he prepared to leave, mounting his horse in the December cold with his notes tucked inside his coat where the wind could not reach them, he made a decision that he would maintain for the rest of his life. The name would not go into his record. It had stayed private for 60 years because the people who knew it had decided it should be private. He was not in a position to override that decision. Some things belong to the people who made them. The archivist's job is not always to surface everything. Sometimes it is to understand what was buried and why, and to let the why stand. Horace Cavender never published anything about the Cornett farmhouse. The notes survived because he gave them on his death in the early 1920s to a nephew with a brief written instruction. These belong in an institution that will handle them carefully, and I leave it to you to find one. The nephew, a practical man who did not share his uncle's antiquarian inclinations but respected them, took the instruction seriously. The notes passed through several custodians and eventually came to rest in a small local archive in Harlan County sometime in the mid-20th century. By then, the farmhouse itself was gone. The coal industry had come to Poor Fork and had reshaped the landscape so completely that the ground where the farmhouse had stood was unrecognizable, regraded, rerouted, incorporated into the infrastructure of extraction. The passage was gone, the root cellar was gone. The fireplace, the stone walls, the compacted earth floor of the corridor, the timber ceiling beams, the marks, all of it gone. What remained was paper. The count was 112. 112 people who passed through that farmhouse across more than 30 years in circumstances that required absolute concealment. Each mark on that wall said only one thing: someone was here, someone passed through, someone was counted. Whether they found what they were looking for is not a question that the Cornett farmhouse's history can answer. The marks recorded their passage, not their destination or their fate. Margaret Cornett had chosen the record over the recognition. She had understood, perhaps from the very beginning, from the moment she made that first mark on the root cellar wall in the summer of 1849, that the recognition was not possible and was not the point. The marks were not for posterity, they were not for history, they were for the count itself, for the accuracy of the count. For the fact of 112 being exactly 112 and not an approximation. They were, as she had written in the letter that Cavender found and that no one can now locate, the only monument that was possible and the only one that was wanted. And then there is the name at the end of the wall. The name that Horace Cavender heard from Hattie Fowler on a December afternoon at the head of Martin's Fork, and that he chose not to record, and that died with both of them. It is possible that someone, somewhere, knows that name. It is possible that among the descendants of the 112, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who passed through the Cornett Passage and continued north, who built leaves in Ohio and Indiana, and points further, who carried with them the memory or the story or simply the fact of their own survival. It is possible that someone knows where it began, knows the name of the farm on Poor Fork, knows the name carved at the end of that wall. It is also possible that they do not. That the connection between that first mark in 1849 and everything that followed it was severed precisely as intended. Completely, cleanly, with nothing trailing behind to endanger anyone. Here is the question this story leaves you with, and I want you to actually sit with it before you answer. Margaret Cornett spent decades doing something extraordinary, and she made absolutely sure that no one would ever be able to fully credit her for it. She chose the safety of other people over her own place in history. In a world where everyone seems to be chasing recognition, does that kind of deliberate anonymity feel like sacrifice to you, or does it feel like the purest form of strength? Drop your answer in the comments below. I genuinely want to know what you think, because stories like this one deserve that conversation and almost never get it. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who understands that the most unsettling history is the kind that actually happened. Subscribe to the Fear Sermon, hit the notification bell, and we will see you in the next one.